The romantic image of the Age of Sail, the grand ships, the swelling music, the heroic captains, is one of history's greatest marketing scams. The reality was a floating, creaking nightmare run by a rulebook that feels like it was written by a committee of madmen, pirates, and your most annoying bureaucratic boss. Today, we're not talking about the epic battles. We're exposing the microscopic, baffling, and downright idiotic rules that governed every second of a sailor's life. This is the story of how the most powerful navy on Earth was fueled by superstition, absurdity, and a whole lot of tar. 1. The official cure for drowning was a puff of smoke. Up your, Alright, let's just get this one out of the way. Picture this. Your buddy falls overboard and you heroically pull his waterlogged body back on deck. He's not breathing. What do? Well, in the 18th century, the official medical guide didn't say check his airway. It said, and I am not making this up, to get the special tobacco enema kit. This was a real device complete with a bellows and a pipe, designed to blow smoke directly into his backside. The genius-level thinking was that this would somehow warm him up from the inside and jolt him back to life. This was considered the peak of emergency medicine. So the first thing you might experience after near death was a surprise smoke signal from your nether regions. 2. Your biscuit came with free wiggly protein. The main food source on a ship was a biscuit so hard you could use it to patch a hole in the hull. But these hardtack crackers came with a special feature: a thriving community of little black bugs called weevils. Now, a normal person might see this and lose their appetite. But on a Navy ship, complaining about your food being infested was the ultimate social blunder. It was a sign of weakness. You were expected to just eat it and call the bugs extra protein. There was a technique where you could tap the biscuit on the table, and most of the bugs would fall out. But that was for the fancy lads. Real sailors just closed their eyes, chewed fast, and tried to convince themselves it was just a bit of a peppery crunch. 3. You were required to wear pants made of tar. Getting wet at sea was a constant problem. But before waterproof fabrics, the Royal Navy had its own brilliant, high-tech solution: tar. Yes, the same sticky black gunk they smeared all over the ship. Sailors were ordered to soak their trousers in it to make them water-resistant. The result was a pair of pants so stiff they could probably stand up and salute on their own. They were sticky, they smelled awful, and walking must have sounded like stepping on a fly trap. But this wasn't seen as a bizarre punishment. It was considered the absolute height of practical naval fashion. You weren't just wearing pants. You were wearing a personal, wearable piece of road construction. 4. Whistling was considered a personal insult to the wind. Imagine you're having a decent day, feeling a little cheerful, so you start whistling a happy tune. On a Navy ship, this was a massive mistake. The entire crew would stop and stare at you in horror, because there was a rock-solid rule against it. Apparently, the wind was believed to be a very sensitive and moody entity. Whistling was seen as mocking the wind's own whistling sound, and the wind would get so offended that it would whip up a giant storm out of pure spite. It's like the wind hears your little tune and thinks, "Oh, you think you're so clever? I'll show you some real whistling." And suddenly you're in the middle of a hurricane, all because you were too cheerful. 5. Your bed was also your coffin, which is a terrible 2-for-1 deal. A sailor's hammock was his only slice of personal paradise on a crowded ship. It was his bed, his chair, his quiet spot. But it came with a rather grim catch. It was also his coffin. If a sailor passed away at sea, the crew didn't bother with fancy caskets. They just took the guy, stitched him up nice and tight inside his own hammock, added a cannonball for weight so he wouldn't pop back up, and gave him the old heave-ho over the side. It was horribly efficient. It's like finding out the warranty on your mattress also doubles as your last will and testament. Sweet dreams. 6. You had to toast the king while sitting down to avoid brain damage. In the officers' quarters, toasting the reigning monarch was a sacred tradition. But they did it in a very peculiar way, sitting down. This wasn't because they were lazy or disrespectful. It was because the ceilings on these old ships were built incredibly low. Any officer who patriotically jumped to his feet to honor his king would be rewarded with the sound of his own skull cracking against a solid oak beam, followed by a brief nap on the floor. To preserve both naval skulls and royal dignity, it became an official rule to just stay seated. It was a rare case of a rule being born from pure, repeated, head-thumping common sense. 7. The ship's cat was an official employee with a paycheck. Every ship had a rat problem. A massive, furry, disease-carrying rat problem. The Navy's solution was the most advanced pest control system of the day, a cat. But this wasn't just some stray they picked up at the docks. The ship's cat was often a card-carrying member of the crew. It would be officially listed in the ship's log, hold a formal position, and receive its own daily rations. In many cases, the cat's food allowance was better than that of the youngest human sailors on board. This feline wasn't a pet. It was a salaried professional in charge of rodent management and probably got more respect than half the crew. 8. You had to follow a strict beard dress code. The Victorian Royal Navy was obsessed with appearances, and that obsession extended to every sailor's face. The rules for facial hair were incredibly specific and left no room for creativity. You had exactly two choices. You could either be completely clean-shaven, smooth as a baby's bottom, or you had to sport what they called a full set, a glorious full beard connected to a mustache. Anything else was illegal. A standalone mustache, band, a cool soul patch, get out of here. It was all or nothing. Your face was basically government property, and you were not allowed to landscape it without permission from the Admiralty's Style Committee. 9. You had to salute an empty deck because it had feelings. When a sailor stepped onto the quarterdeck, the ship's command center, he was required to salute. This rule applied even if the deck was completely empty. No captain, no officers, not even the ship's cat. You were literally saluting a pile of wood. The tradition was supposed to honor the authority of the ship itself, but it came across as a rule made to ensure the deck didn't feel ignored or get its feelings hurt. It's a wonderful image. A tough, hardened sailor offering a crisp salute to a vacant space, just in case the floorboards were feeling a bit insecure that day. 10. The entire ship ran on a strict alcohol timetable. The Royal Navy wasn't just a military force, it was the world's most powerful institution that ran on a daily dose of rum, known as grog. The time for the grog ration was the most sacred moment of the day, more important than naval drills or battle preparations. The entire rhythm of life on board was built around this alcoholic appointment. Missing it was a catastrophe of epic proportions. The ship didn't run on wind power. It ran on a precisely timed rum-fueled schedule. It was less of a warship and more of a highly organized floating pub with cannons attached. 11. A serious punishment. Was given a ridiculously poetic name. If a sailor committed a serious offense, he might be sentenced to a punishment called kissing the gunner's daughter. This sounds almost whimsical, like a scene from a light-hearted play. But in reality, it was the Navy's cutesy, creative name for being tied over the barrel of a cannon for a whipping. It's a perfect example of the Navy's bizarre habit of giving its disciplinary actions these weirdly gentle names. It's like calling a trip to the dentist Tickle Time with Dr. Chompy. The name sounds charming. The experience was anything but. 12. Taking a quick nap on the job was a career-ending move. Everyone loves a good power nap, but if you were on watch in the Royal Navy, dozing off was the worst decision you could possibly make. According to the official Articles of War, the penalty for falling asleep on your watch was death. There were no second chances, no written warnings, no meetings with human resources. It was a zero-tolerance policy on snoozing. Your 5-minute dream about being literally anywhere else could abruptly end with you being permanently relieved of duty, and also of life. It's probably the most extreme, no sleeping at your desk rule in history. 13. The Navy knew the cure for scurvy, but decided to ignore it for 50 years. Scurvy was a horrific disease that plagued sailors for centuries. By the mid-1700s, a naval surgeon proved that it could be easily cured with citrus fruits like lemons and limes. So, did the Admiralty immediately stock every ship with fruit? Of course not. They spent the next half-century basically ignoring this life-saving discovery, convinced their old, ineffective methods were better. It's a masterclass in bureaucratic stubbornness. Thousands of sailors suffered because the big bosses in London thought they knew better than the doctors. They had the answer, but they preferred to stick with the problem. 14. The ship's doctor was also your barber, so choose your words. Carefully. On board a naval vessel, the man in charge of your health was the barber surgeon. This one-stop shop of a professional could go from giving you a neat haircut and a shave to amputating your leg, possibly using a similar set of tools. You could literally ask for a little off the top and have to be very, very specific about what you meant. It was the ultimate combo deal, born out of a need for efficiency. Hopefully, he remembered to wipe his scissors down between appointments. 15. Kneeling for hours to scrub the floor was called prayer. Sailors had to spend endless hours on their knees, scrubbing the wooden decks with large sandstones called holy stones. The job was so named because it forced them into a position that looked like prayer. It was exhausting, back-breaking work that was mostly designed just to keep the massive crew busy and too tired to think about causing trouble. It was the ultimate form of pointless manual labor, disguised as a cleaning chore that doubled as a lesson in humility. The decks were probably the cleanest things on the entire ocean, but at what cost to sailors' knees? 16. The secret to battle protection was not showering. In an age before antibiotics, any wound could be a death sentence. So what was the Navy's brilliant idea for protection? A thick, personal layer of grime. Many sailors held a superstitious belief, which became an unofficial rule, that it was bad luck to wash before a battle. They thought that a coating of dirt and grease on their skin would somehow block infections from getting into any potential wounds. It was a bizarre theory that turned poor hygiene into a legitimate military tactic. Being clean was for peacetime. Battle required you to be as filthy as possible. 17. The Navy's recruitment strategy was basically, surprise, you're a sailor now. If the Navy was short on men, they sent out press gangs. These weren't friendly job recruiters with pamphlets. Their job was to wander the streets of port towns, find any able-bodied man, and legally kidnap him into naval service. One minute, you could be enjoying a quiet drink at the pub, and the next you're waking up on a ship halfway to the Atlantic with a multi-year contract you never signed. It was a government-approved system of involuntary hiring, and probably the world's most aggressive and effective job placement program. 18. The best shooters were placed in the most obvious target spots. The ship's snipers or marines were given the best vantage point on the ship, high up on the masts, on platforms called fighting tops. From here, they could see everything and pick off enemies on the other ship. There was just one tiny design flaw in this plan. It also made them the most visible, exposed, and perfect targets for the enemy's snipers. It was like painting a giant bullseye on your best marksman and then yelling to the enemy, "Hey, don't shoot this guy up here who is all by himself." It was a job with a great view and absolutely zero cover. 19. The open-air bathroom was described as a privilege. The sailor's toilet, known as the head, was located at the very front of the ship. It consisted of a basic wooden plank with holes in it, hanging over the open ocean. You got to enjoy the fresh sea breeze, along with the occasional giant wave that would serve as an unexpected and very aggressive bidet. In a stunning display of positive marketing, access to this windswept, splash-prone facility was officially referred to as a privilege. It was anything but. It was cold, wet, and offered absolutely no privacy, making it less of a privilege and more of a public ordeal. 20. The floor was painted red to keep things looking tidy. On many warships, the decks were painted a deep red or reddish-brown color. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was a shockingly practical, if grim, interior design choice. The reason was that during a battle, the decks would get very messy with blood and gore. By pre-staining the floor red, all that mess would be less noticeable and wouldn't upset the crew or distract them from their work. It was a way of psychologically managing the chaos by making sure any spills would match the existing color scheme. 21. Punishments were conducted like a Broadway show. When a sailor was to be flogged, it wasn't a quick affair. It was a full-blown theatrical production with a strict script. The entire crew would be called to watch. An officer would formally read the charges. A drummer would perform a dramatic drum roll. And a surgeon would stand by, not to help the man, but to make sure he didn't pass out too early, which would spoil the show. It was a ceremony designed for maximum impact, turning a simple punishment into a highly choreographed all-hands-on-deck performance. 22. The last person down from the mast lost the game. After adjusting the sails high up on the masts, sailors would scramble back down to the deck. To encourage speed, there was a cruel but effective unofficial rule. The last man down would get a whack with a rope's end from the boatswain. This turned every single maneuver into a frantic, high-stakes race. It didn't matter how well you did your job up there. What mattered was not being the slowest one back. It was a terrible motivational technique that relied on the simple fear of being the last one to the finish line. 23. Officers got to walk on the side with better air quality. On a crowded, smelly ship, fresh air was a luxury. By unwritten rule, officers had the privilege of walking on the windward side of the deck, the side where the wind was coming from. This meant they got to breathe in the clean sea air. The regular crew had to stay on the leeward or downwind side. This is where all the ripe smells from the crew's living quarters, the livestock, and the toilets would be blown. It was a system of airborne social hierarchy, ensuring the fanciest noses got the freshest air. 24. Crossing the equator involved a mandatory welcome party from hell. When a ship crossed the equator for the first time on a voyage, a bizarre ceremony was held for all the new sailors, or polywogs. It was an officially sanctioned hazing ritual where the veteran sailors, dressed up as King Neptune and his court, would subject the newcomers to a series of humiliating trials. This often included being shaved with a rusty, blunt piece of metal and being dunked in a tub of disgusting, stagnant water. It was the Navy's version of a corporate team-building exercise, if that exercise was designed by lunatics. 25. Dinner conversation with officers was guaranteed to be boring. In the officers' mess, there was a strict rule to ensure polite company. 3 topics were absolutely forbidden at the dinner table. You could not discuss politics, religion, or women. While this probably prevented a lot of arguments, it also sucked all the life out of the conversation, turning what should have been a social hour into an exercise in finding something, anything, neutral to talk about. The weather must have been discussed in excruciating detail every single night. 26. The captain could both command you and marry you. The captain of a ship held immense power. He could order you into a battle that would be your last. But he also had another stranger authority. He had the legal right to officiate a marriage ceremony. It's a weird mix of job responsibilities. One day he's in charge of naval strategy and discipline, and the next he's helping 2 people tie the knot on the high seas. Your boss could sentence you to hard labor and also pronounce you husband and wife, which is a truly bizarre combination of powers. 27. The main gunnery strategy was just shoot when it feels right. Aiming a cannon on a rocking ship was nearly impossible. So a common command for gunners was fire as she bears. This basically meant don't worry too much about precise aiming. Just load the cannon, and when the natural roll of the ship happens to point it in the general direction of the enemy, pull the cord and hope for the best. It was less a science and more a game of chance, turning naval battles into a chaotic exercise of timing and luck. 28. Losing a musket meant entering a paperwork nightmare. If a sailor lost his issued musket, even if it was washed overboard during a massive storm, he was in for a world of bureaucratic pain. The cost of the weapon would be deducted from his tiny salary over a period of years. But worse, he had to navigate a mountain of paperwork to report the loss. The Navy seemed more concerned with the administrative hassle of a missing musket than with the fact that the man holding it had just survived a hurricane. The real punishment wasn't losing the gun, it was dealing with the paperwork after. 29. The butter on the menu was better as a machine lubricant. The food provided to sailors had to last for years, and the butter was no exception. It was stored in wooden barrels for so long that it became rancid, hard, and completely inedible. It was so foul that it was often used by sailors not as food, but as grease for the ship's moving parts or as a waterproofing polish for their boots. The fact that this substance was still officially classified as butter and part of their diet is a testament to the Navy's incredibly low standards for what could be considered food. 30. Keeping your hands out of your pockets was a top priority, even in a hurricane. To this day, sailors are forbidden from putting their hands in their pockets while in uniform. The rule is meant to promote a sharp, disciplined appearance. But this rule applied at all times, in all conditions. Imagine trying to stay upright on a slippery, storm-tossed deck, with freezing winds and rain lashing down, and some officer yells at you because your hands are in your pockets seeking a moment's warmth. It's a perfect example of military appearance standards completely ignoring the reality of the situation. 31. The prize money system was a glorified pyramid scheme. When a Navy ship captured an enemy vessel, the ship and its cargo were sold, and the money was distributed to the crew as a prize. But the distribution was hilariously unfair. The captain and top officers would receive massive fortunes, enough to retire comfortably. The regular sailors who did most of the dangerous fighting, however, would receive a tiny pittance, maybe enough to buy a few rounds of drinks at the next port. It was the most lopsided and unfair bonus system ever created, making the rich officers richer and leaving the regular guys with pocket change. 32. You had to wear a leather collar of pure discomfort. To enforce good posture and a disciplined look, sailors and Marines had to wear a stock, a stiff leather collar that wrapped tightly around the neck. It was designed to keep your chin up and your posture straight, but in practice, it was just an instrument of constant agony. It chafed your neck raw, made it hard to breathe, and was incredibly hot. It was supposed to instill discipline, but it probably only instilled a deep and abiding hatred for military fashion standards. 33. You were often armed with a giant spear in a gunfight. Even well into the age of cannons and pistols, a primary weapon for sailors boarding an enemy ship was the pike. A very long spear. Pikes were great weapons in the 16th century for fighting guys on horses, but they were a bit outdated when the enemy is pointing a flintlock pistol at your face from a few feet away. Still, the Navy insisted on arming its men with these giant, unwieldy pointy sticks for close-quarters combat. It was a case of bringing a very long, old-fashioned knife to a gunfight. 34. The job of powder monkey was an after-school program from hell. During the heat of battle, cannons needed a constant supply of gunpowder from the ship's magazine deep below. The job of fetching it was given to powder monkeys, who were the youngest boys on the ship, some as young as 8 or 10 years old. They were chosen because their small size made them nimble and harder to hit. It was an official, accepted practice of using children for one of the most dangerous jobs on the entire ship. It was less of an apprenticeship and more of a terrifying game of tag with cannonballs. 35. There was a super strict etiquette for passing the wine bottle. In the officers' mess, after-dinner port wine came with a set of rules more complex than the ship's rigging. The bottle, or decanter, had to be passed to the left, and it was a major social foul to set it down on the table until it had gone all the way around and returned to the host. The whole process was a silent, intensely serious ritual. The fate of your career could hang on whether you remembered to pass the port correctly. It was the most high-stakes wine night ever. 36. Losing your rum ration. Was a fate worse than flogging? To a sailor, the daily grog ration was more than just a drink. It was a fundamental right. For many, the most terrifying punishment the captain could hand out wasn't a physical beating. It was stopping their grog. Taking away a man's rum was seen as an act of profound cruelty, a psychological blow that could crush his spirit far more than any whip. It was the ultimate leverage the officers had, because they knew the entire ship ran on a delicate balance of discipline and daily rum. 37. The no women on board rule had a convenient loophole. Officially, women were not allowed on Royal Navy ships. But there was a massive, unwritten loophole. When a ship was in port for an extended period, it was common for sailors to bring women on board who they would introduce as their wives. The officers would generally look the other way, and these port wives would live on the ship with the crew until it was time to sail again. It was a practical solution to a human problem, all based on a collective agreement to pretend the official rule didn't exist. 38. They threw sand on the floor before a fight for better traction. Before a battle, one of the standard preparations was to have sailors scatter sand all over the main decks. This wasn't for cleaning, it was to provide better footing. They knew that the deck would soon become incredibly slippery with blood, and they didn't want sailors losing their grip while trying to run around and operate the cannons. It was a grimly practical piece of housekeeping, like putting down a non-slip mat in a bathroom, but for a much messier situation. 39. Cleaning up stains was the first thing you did after a battle. Once the cannon fire stopped and the enemy had surrendered, you'd think the first priority would be tending to the wounded or assessing damage. Often, it wasn't. One of the first orders given was to get to work scrubbing the bloodstains off the decks and woodwork. The Navy was obsessed with maintaining a clean and orderly ship, and this obsession extended to post-battle cleanup. This often took precedence over everything else because nothing says, "We won," like a spotlessly clean ship, even if it's half destroyed. 40. Pointing at things with one finger was considered extremely rude to the ocean. Sailors had a whole list of superstitions, and one of the strangest was the rule against pointing. It was considered terrible luck to point at another ship or at a distant shore with a single finger. It was believed to provoke the wrath of the sea or bring bad fortune down on whatever you were pointing at. To be safe, you had to gesture with your whole open hand. It was a weird rule of nautical etiquette that treated the ocean like a sensitive being who was easily offended by rude gestures. 41. The entire Navy was afraid of Fridays. One of the most deeply rooted superstitions was that it was incredibly bad luck to begin a voyage on a Friday. This belief was so powerful that it became an unwritten but ironclad rule. The British Admiralty, the powerful body that ran the entire Navy, would almost always schedule departures for any day but Friday. A multi-ton warship, the pinnacle of military technology at the time, would sit in port for an extra day, all because the date on the calendar was considered spooky. 42. A common cure for boredom was to repaint the entire ship. During long, tedious naval blockades where a ship might sit in the same spot for months, a captain's greatest enemy was a board crew. To keep the men occupied, commanders would often invent massive, pointless tasks. A favorite was ordering the entire ship to be repainted, from top to bottom. Once they were done, he might just order them to paint it back to the original color. It served no practical purpose other than to keep hundreds of men busy and too exhausted to complain. 43. Certain animals could not be named out loud. Sailors were also convinced that saying certain words on a ship would summon disaster. The word rabbit, for instance, was strictly forbidden, as was pig. It was believed that these land-based animals would cause the ship to run aground. Instead, sailors had to use weird euphemisms like long-eared furry thing. Imagine a crew of tough men who faced down cannon fire and storms, being genuinely terrified to say the word rabbit. 44. You stopped getting paid the instant your ship sank. Here is the final, brutal insult of naval bureaucracy. A sailor's pay was officially logged as stopping the very second his ship disappeared beneath the waves. If you were lucky enough to survive a shipwreck and were now clinging to a piece of floating debris in the middle of the ocean, you were doing so as an unemployed person. The Navy considered its contract with you fulfilled the moment its property, the ship, was gone. Congratulations on surviving, you're now doing it on your own time. And there you have it. 44 rules that prove life in the age of sail was less about glorious adventure and more about surviving a floating world of bizarre superstitions and bureaucratic insanity. Which of these rules do you think is the absolute dumbest? Let us know in the comments below, because I'm genuinely curious how you'd even begin to choose. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more dives into the weirdest parts of history.